Thank you. And thank you for joining the webinar. We will be talking about Flosum, DevOps, and Salesforce. A little bit of the agenda. So we're going to talk about why DevOps and Salesforce is different. And then according to the Salesforce trailhead that I took yesterday, stories are the best way to make an impact and to remember stuff. And then in fact, stories are 8 times more likely to be remembered. And we have a great story and a great customer success story with IBR that Adam Brown will be explaining about using DevOps and improving DevOps with the Navy. After that, we'll have a demo of the Flosum release management product. It will show you exactly what Adam was working with. And after that, any questions that you put in the chat, we'll be able to answer. So what are the challenges you face in doing DevOps? So DevOps is the back-end stuff that it's where the magic happens, where people say, I need something done. And somebody has to go through the developers, the smart people that actually are writing the code and doing the work. But what are the challenges that they face? As teams get large, it doesn't necessarily happen better, right? So the more people you add to a team and the more teams you add to a project, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go twice as fast. So here's some of the things that they run into. The deployments are taking too long. People are overwriting their code. There's no version control. They may think one thing should be an oval, another thing should be a square, and that will cause something to fail. So these are things when you hear projects are behind, sometimes people are facing these challenges with the important people doing the code and doing the work on the back end to make the things in the Salesforce on the front end look great. So these are some of the challenges they face, and we at Flosum have figured out a way to put it all in one package, one platform, to help people do better and deploy faster and be more successful in their Salesforce deployments. Next slide, please. So what makes this different? And Adam will get into this, but just at a very high level, there are 3 ways that we see people doing deployments. Sometimes they do it by themselves. They do it the do-it-yourself approach, where they get open source stuff that's available, and it works well. But again, as things get big and things are large and important, that might not work. Now, there are other products on the App Exchange that do this, but they're basically putting a interface on top of Salesforce, but they do not meet the important FedRAMP requirements. So only Flosum is the only one that will work all within one platform, combining the power of Salesforce, the platform of Salesforce, the security Salesforce, but it will also integrate open source and other testing protocols and requirements management and other things that are part of your release management platform. So again, this product was built for Salesforce by people that work there, and it will help your deployments go better. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to introduce Adam Brown, who's going to take it over and tell us the story about how he was successful and how he helped the Navy. Adam.
Thanks, Bill. So we're going to talk about Flosum, and I'm going to give a quick introduction to IBR. We have over 100 employees. We're a Salesforce partner. We have several relevant partnerships with AWS, Microsoft, Okta, and a company called LifeRay. You can see our website, and we're going to talk about how we used Flosum and Salesforce to perform one of the Navy's NPT&E transformation efforts. Next slide, please. So this is a Navy slide. You can see their IT challenges. I'm sure this is familiar to anyone in the DoD space. Overly complex systems, limited user self-service, lots of APIs and lots of interconnected systems with no central point of access, and they're all back office focused. They don't make it easy to get what you need or to make updates to the system. All right, next slide. So here's their transformation goals. For this talk, we're going to focus pretty much exclusively on the lower right quadrant, the COTS strategy and governance, APIs, and software as a service. But you can see everything else there, single point of entry, mobile access, warehouse consolidation. The Navy actually calls this the 55-to-1 transformation effort because it literally is 55 systems going into one. All right, next slide, please. Here is the big boy that you can see. how everything is funneling into four key points along with the data warehouse there. And CRM, obviously, being a huge back office component of this thing, is circled in red there. And this really, we can provide this slide. Obviously, this is too much to go over right now, but this really shows the enormity of the task that the Navy wants to do to modernize their systems. Okay, next slide. So Navy ECRM is sourced from the Navy's PMW 240, which controls human resources, recruiting, things like that. And there are two production orgs. The reason there are two is because they came out of two separate efforts and they have separate cybersecurity requirements. There's the My Navy HR org, which supports things like the My Navy Career Center, which is a call-in service for anyone in the Navy, was in the Navy, spouses, dependents, things like that. Anyone that calls or chats on the web goes through this application. There are also other things like the Physical Readiness Management System, which controls all the Navy's physical fitness tests and promotions and things like that, and some other applications that are placed in there. And then, of course, Navy recruiting is a wholly contained Salesforce org, which supports the entire recruiting operation for the Navy, enlisted and officer based. Every recruiter in the Navy, every recruit in the Navy goes through there. All right, and then, oh, sorry, still on that, go back one slide. And of course, we have our external interfaces to legacy systems, other SaaS systems. In some cases, they're commercial systems that don't have an accreditation, things like credit bureaus. And so those present some interesting cyber challenges. We have 3 Scrum teams with 25 developers, and we have an IL4 security posture, which is extremely important if you want to handle any data of consequence. Okay, next slide, please. So the DevOps on a SaaS is problematic, as most of you probably know. There's not a lot of low-level capabilities that you have access to. You can't get into the networks and you can't get into the server level. You have to take what they give you and manage it that way. It can make following traditional processes, designed for missile systems and other weapon systems a lot more complicated because you just simply don't have the access, and all the forms and everything like that are all keyed towards that. So trying to get a modern DevSecOps process onto SaaS is complicated. But when it's implemented correctly, you can reduce manual intervention, increase quality, reduce time to delivery, enhance the security posture, and most importantly, make things a lot cheaper. Okay, next. So Flosum is what we chose to use for several reasons. One is self-contained within the org, which allows it to be used in an IL4 system. No other solution that was out there met that goal. Like there were no FedRAMP and no IL4 accredited systems. We took that and were able to use it to design the first of its kind in the Navy software pipeline based on a traditional Git flow model to deliver Salesforce updates, following all the Navy processes, but still reducing the time to production. So what Flosum mostly allowed us to do is, and I'm just going to read these because these are very important. They allowed us to increase our developer velocity by 1/3 from 5 points to 8 points. We got rid of merge stomping almost entirely. And Bill kind of touched on that earlier, but that was a huge, huge rework problem because, whether you're working in your own org or in a shared org, it's very difficult to keep your code separate, to if you're working ahead and behind, maybe you're working on a hot fix, someone else is working on a new feature, but you're touching the same object or standard objects, things like that get incredibly complex to deal with. And so we had about a 20% rework rate, and now it's basically gone. We cut our release window in half. Following the Navy processes, you have to design, test, get customer approval, and then you have to deliver it to a government system, and then they have to do their testing, and then they certify it, and then they have to test the deployment. So those are all, when you're dealing, again, with weapon systems, embedded systems, those are all extremely important and very, difficult to get exactly right, which is why they do it over and over again. But with a SaaS, you don't necessarily need that, but you need to show that you are following the same type of process where, you're not just throwing things out there and fixing it live. This also allowed us to go from 2 full-time release managers on a contract to 1 release manager working about 25% of the time. And what, we still have to have a release manager on our contract, but this allowed us to free him up. He was a developer, and so it allowed us to use him as extra velocity to meet stretch goals and to accelerate deployments. And like I mentioned before, redeploying to production over and over again is extremely hard to do with a change set, because the change set only lasts until you execute it and then it's invalid. But Flosum allowed us to, take the software build, as it were, all the XML and all the Apex code, and then deploy it to a recently refreshed org, try it out, look at our process, and then start all over until we got it right. And that way we didn't have to go to the government until we were absolutely ready. And that saved a lot of back and forth and a lot of questions and trust issues that the government had with software as a service releases. And then the Salesforce platform releases can throw a monkey wrench into things. If your releases don't exactly line up for whatever reason, we have worked out a way to create sandboxes in either preview or non-preview, for those of you that are familiar with the platform. And then we can switch at will and just say, all right, deploy the latest release to whichever one we need, to whichever one we want to test right now. And we can get an org up and running for the government to try out for any kind of testing, any kind of validation, inside of an hour, assuming that the Salesforce queue is not too backed up. All right, next slide, please. So here's our desired development path. This is a traditional get flow model. You have your master, which is representative of production. And then you can see things like the hotfix, it's just a quick little branch down there, but it also has to be merged into your main develop, so that the developers don't overwrite your hotfix. And then also, you can have your feature branches off from develop and they can move along and then merge back in. And then you have your releases and things like that. There's nothing special about this, but one of the key things that this allows us to do is, by following this kind of process, we don't have to hire only Salesforce developers. We can hire any developer and train them on how Salesforce works. And then we cut down our ramp up time and also increase the available hiring pool. Okay, next slide, please. So here's how we manage our environments with the government. In the beginning, they wanted, I think, 7 orgs in between dev and production. There was QA, there was test, there was government QA, there was government test, there was accreditation testing, there was training, our integration, things like that. And that's obviously not tenable, that's not, or sustainable, I should say. And so when we got Flosum installed and we got everything stood up, we were able to show them this slide and explain how that they didn't need to do that. That it really only needed to go to 3 different places before it goes to production. There's the individual dev orgs, and developers develop all the time. And then as people check in user stories and merge, they merge them back to the individual developer environments, or they do a refresh and reapply. And again, that timing is almost nothing, because it only takes a couple minutes to deploy a Flosum branch to your org. We have an integration where we do our initial testing to make sure that we haven't broken anything. And then we invite the government in there to validate the feature. It's a stovepipe test. They're not checking, even though it's called integration, they're not checking everything. They're just checking to make sure that, yes, this story works as we have designed it. It looks good, the colors are right, things like that, the pixel placement, etc. And then that lets us move forward to packaging a release. And the releases come at the whim of the customer. So, and we're always ready. They can say, all right, we're ready for a release this weekend. And so, and give us a couple weeks notice. And so we'll package up and deploy to test. We'll refresh it from production. We'll deploy it as if we're actually deploying to production. And we'll show, they observe this and they see our process, our checklists, and, how Flosum goes through and the impact analysis and everything. And then they run their tests and, they approve it from there and it goes straight to production. Sometimes we use the full and partial copy if we are doing something that might affect data, like if we need to see how the territory model is going to affect the recruiting districts in the country, we would use staging or support, which are accredited environments because they have IL4 data in them, obviously. And this allows us to really hammer out any last minute issues so that we don't get to production and get surprised. All right, next slide, please. And so here's our workflow. This is a workflow that started out and it probably had 30 boxes when we started the contract. And then this is what it is currently. Basically, you start developing a story, you unit test it, you move it to integration. Once it's in integration, the government checks it out. And then in Agile Accelerator, they just drag it to the next box. And because they have to log in with their CAC card or their CACs into Salesforce, that is the same. We've got them to their cybersecurity to certify that as saying that they have signed off on it. And so once it's dragged into that accepted column, then it's ready for release testing. And we like I said, we package up releases. Maybe, a release might be one story, it could be 40. It just all depends. But once a story is completed, it is moved into that release bucket, and then the bill just keeps getting bigger and bigger until they decide they're ready for release. And then that's it. Once it goes to release testing and goes straight to production. And we can follow this whole process if there's an emergency hot fix without skipping any steps in less than 8 hours if there's an emergency. Okay, next slide. So that's pretty much it. Flosum allows us to do our Agile methodologies, hire standard developers, hire Salesforce developers, and blend them all together into an extremely efficient pipeline for software updates. We built this pipeline with the DoD in mind. We have lots of other projects that are not Salesforce based that need this kind of scrutiny on how things get there. And while it's a lot easier to do those with a traditional pipeline, Flosum lets us essentially graph that pipeline onto our Navy process. And then, of course, it allows us to adhere to the DevSecOps standards, which greatly increases the government trust and allows us to release things faster and not go through so many steps that are not necessary when the government believes and trusts what you're doing. Are there any questions?
Hey, thank you, Adam. That was fantastic. And now we are going to take a moment to show a lot of the stuff. Adam was at a very high level. It's a great story. It's a great success story with the Navy. And now we're going to take a moment to show you what's under the hood. All the stuff that Adam talked about in the Salesforce platform. We'll give a brief demonstration of the product. Notice when John gives the demo that he never leaves the Salesforce environment. So that's part of what Adam talked about for the DevSecOps portion, that we follow the FedRAMP, and we never leave Salesforce. There's no Heroku, there's nothing on it. So you'll be, for those that are worried about FedRAMP and compliance, this is a great solution.
Those activities between them. So I want to start in my Dev2 sandbox record. Hi, my name is John Coolidge. I'm a solutions engineer at Flosum. I'm going to show you a brief demo of the Flosum release management solution. We're going to take some changes from our Dev2 sandbox. We're going to commit them to a branch. We're going to take that branch, do some pre-deployment activities, and we're going to deploy it to our SIT org. I will show you how we can roll that back if needed. And then if there's time left, I will show you some of the additional features that I find compelling as well. So to begin, we start off in our orgs view. This is where all of our sandboxes, test organizations, and production org are all registered in Flosum, so we can perform all those activities between them. So I want to start in my Dev2 sandbox record. Within here, there will be a list of the latest components. I want to search some of these components and commit them to my branch, so I select the Commit to Branch button. I want to give my branch a name. So I want it to be something relevant, so I'm using today's date with an A, but you can use anything you want. User story numbers, anything like that. And then to select the relevant components, I can do a few different things. I can sort by these column headers to find the different changes. So if I want to see when it was changed, who it was changed by. I can go in and select specific component types that are in this release. So if I know that I have some Apex classes or Apex pages I want to work on, or I can do just a simple text search. So I know that I've used a naming scheme of some of my components that I want to deploy, so I can select that. And it'll come back and show me all the components with that particular name. So I want to select some of these. These are the components that I want to commit to my branch, so I select on the continue to commit to branch. Now if this was an existing branch, it would look for any conflicts that may exist, and they would be listed up here, and I would have to resolve them before I commit these to the branch. But in this case it's a new branch, so we're just going to select our components and we're going to commit them to our branch. So now we have our branch with our components in Flosum. We have a timeline over here, so you'll see everything that's going on in this branch, all the different activities as you go through and do them. The first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we're not missing any dependent components in this branch. So when we try to deploy this, we won't have any errors of these missing components. So we click on our View Dependencies. We select our org. And it'll go through and it will take those components and look at that org and make sure there's nothing missing that's dependent to that. So as you can see, it came back and it found no dependencies, so I should have no errors deploying this. Now if it did find any dependencies missing, you can very easily select those and add them back into this branch so they can be included with the deployment to make sure you don't run into any of those issues. Next, if you have any destructive changes you want to add, you need to delete anything as part of the deployment, you can add those in this bottom section, whether it has to be done before the deployment or after deployment, depending on any relationships. Once these are added in, they will be included in the deployment, and if you need to roll back this deployment, they will be rolled back as well, so it'll be handled automatically, so you will not need to do these manual steps anymore once you start using Flosum. So the next thing we want to do is we want to do our conflict detection between our branch and the org we want to deploy to. We call that an impact analysis. We click on the impact analysis button. We select our org. And then we do our impact analysis. And again, this will take the components that are in this particular branch and do a real-time comparison to what's in that org, and it'll come back and show us what it sees for differences. So of all the components in this branch, where are their conflicts, and if there's any new components being pushed out, it'll highlight those as well. So you can see what we found in here are 3 actual conflicts and 2 components that are being pushed out that are new. So we need to just worry about these particular conflicts. We need to resolve those before we can do our deployment. So we'll start with our custom field. You click on the different text to go in, and this is what you're seeing now is a result of our internal source control. We take all the underlying code, declarative components, do semantic comparison, clean it up, and give it to you in a nice, easy to use interface. So regardless of what type of component this is, you'll still see it with a side-by-side comparison and differences highlighted in colors signifying what they are. So again, yellow being a change line, red is something that's in the target that is not in the deployment, and new is something that is in the deployment but not yet in the target. So you can see I have 2 conflicts in here. I have a different property here required. If I want to keep this as false, I leave this as is, I do nothing, and it will overwrite the true. But if I want to take true and keep that as part of what's being deployed, I just click on this arrow and that brings it back into the deployment metadata in Flosum. So now in this case, if I want to keep this as date time, I'll do nothing, and date time will be deployed, and this will be overwritten going forward. So we're going to save this. Now it shows up at merge, so we now need to go in and look at our 2 other differences. So let's look at our layout very quickly. Our layout has 8 differences. So as I said, green is something new being deployed we don't need to worry about. It's the yellows and the reds. So again, we have a behavior here that we want to keep, so we'll select that and bring it back to our deployment metadata. Now the red, this layout item is in the the SIT org, but not in my deployment. This could have been done by a hotfix, done manually. So if upon research I determine I need to keep this, again, I would have to click this arrow and bring it over into my deployment metadata, otherwise it'll be overwritten and removed. So I click that. So I'll go through, look at all the yellows and the reds, determine if I want to keep them all. And once I've gone through and resolved those, again, I save this. That's merged. Then I go into this last object. We have 6 differences. So we're just going to assume we're going to take all of those. We'll take you, we'll take you, take you. And I think we're okay. Yeah, all our changes are now merged. So we'll save that. So now that these save merged, it is now safe for us to deploy these to that org, knowing we're not going to lose any code or override any code that exists out there as it is today. So let's go back to our branch now. So the next thing we want to do is we want to deploy this to our SIT org. There's a couple different ways we can do deployments in Flosum. You can do a standard deployment, which will take our components and push them out to whatever org we select. In this case, it'll be our SIT. We also can use a more advanced pipelines functionality, where that's where you get the real power of the solution, where you can chain together multiple steps and execute them all at once. I will show you a standard deployment and rollback first, then we'll go into the actual pipelines. So to deploy this, we choose deploy, we select our org. If we have any Apex test classes to run, you can configure them by the different options down here. In this last option, this is our partial profile deployment. This is selected by default. This ensures that for all the profiles you may have in here, only changes related to the components being deployed or pushed out, not the entire profile. So if I had a user profile in my sandbox with over 200 changes that hadn't been deployed yet, that profile was also in this branch, but only 3 of those changes are related to components in here. Only those 3 changes are pushed out, not the entire profile. If you wanted to push out a new profile or complete profiles, you would uncheck that, and that will not do the safety feature for you. But again, this is selected by default, so you don't have to worry about, after every deployment now, going into your target org and undoing all of those changes in the profiles that your org isn't ready for yet. So next thing we'll do is a real-time deployment. So now we press deploy. I will do this real time so you can see just how fast this is versus other solutions out there. And then we'll review the records, and then we'll go in and I'll show you a rollback. So the first thing we do is we take a backup of the components in that target org, so we have that rollback point. They'll be stored in a zip file and in the deployment record. Then we will take all of the components, we will deploy them out to that org. If there are any test classes configured, we will run those tests as well. Once everything is done, we've seen about 10 seconds now, it'll come back and it will tell us whether it passed or failed, and then we can go on with our next steps. So very, very quickly, much faster than change sets and anything else I'm sure you've seen. So let's take a look. So we go back in here, we look at our success log, and it tells us it deployed the custom fields, custom objects, etc., etc., etc. So it was a successful deployment. So now we go back into our branch. If you look at deployment history, you'll see it's been validated and then deployed to the SIT environment. So now we want to do, for some reason, say we need to roll this deployment back. One thing our customers tell us is because of the checks and balances in the Flosum solution, there's no need to roll back that often. But just in case, we do have that functionality in here, and it's very powerful and easy to use. You would select rollback. Will look very much like a deployment. You select the org you're going to roll back. All of your deployment records to this org will be listed here, not just the most recent. So you could effectively go back 2, 3, 4 releases if you needed to find some old functionality. But in this case, we just have our first deployment here, so we're going to select that. Again, if there are any test classes to run. And then you can see it shows us all the components that were deployed in that particular deployment, so we can determine if we want to roll back all of them or just do a partial rollback of a subset. So I could go in and just, for example, say I need to roll back this value set. Now, obviously, I would want to validate that to make sure that, partial rollbacks especially are going to work. But in this case, we want to roll back everything just to show you how quick that is. So we'll roll it back. And then in a matter of a couple of minutes, it'll be rolled back to that previous state. So you can see our rollback completed. We'll look at the success log again to see that it undid everything that we just deployed. So now we are in that previous state where the end users can do what they need to do in that org while you find out what went wrong in the lower org. And just to show you there were no errors, you can look at the error log as well. It would have failed if there was an error. So now that we've gone through the deployments, I want to show you briefly the pipelines functionality. Pipelines are templates you can set up to use over and over again from any branch to exercise the certain list of steps that you want to deploy. So in this case, I have my pipelines to go to UAT, QA environments. Very important is my back promotion pipeline. This is the pipeline I use that keeps my orgs in sync and makes it so I don't need to worry about doing Salesforce sandbox refreshes anymore, having all my data wiped out, resetting the whole sandbox. This makes it very easy for me to take all my changes once they've been deployed successfully to production and test it back to my sandboxes at one time, again keeping everything in sync. The next pipeline I have is my production pipeline. My production pipeline, what I do in this is I first do a validate. If the validate passes, I go on to step 2, which is deploy. If my deploy passes, I go to the next step, but if it fails, I go to my rollback to make sure I'm not leaving a half-deployed mess in my org. But if it passes, I go to this webhook functionality where you can use any testing program that supports webhooks to do your UI testing, performance testing, security testing, whatever you might need. This step will call out to that service via webhook. It will wait for a response from that service, and then based on that response, it will either, if it passed, it will do nothing because obviously it passed successfully and there's no further work needs to be done. But if it failed, it will roll back production for you, and you can include information in that log that will show you exactly what tests caused this to fail. So very easy, very powerful way to link together these steps and make them execute all at once. And you will get emails on all of the different things you do, so you can execute this and not have to sit here and wait for it to be done to see what happened. You'll get an email saying that the deployment was successful or that it failed and it successfully rolled back, and it'll give you a link to the log so you can see why it rolled back. That concludes the demo. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, John. So that was a really good look of what Flosum is like under the hood, and all the stuff that Adam talked about. So I would just like to go back over some key takeaways from this. That we're the only FedRAMP solution on the App Exchange for DevOps. As these teams get large, as John showed, it can get confusing and things can happen. Change sets will slow down the deployments. Cross-platform tools are fine, but Flosum was built specifically for Salesforce to optimize. As we saw, John never left the Salesforce environment. And again, teams have used measurable productivity gains, and Flosum works with a lot of partners. So people like IBR and other folks out there that can do the work. So we appreciate your time. And next slide.
Thank you, Flosum and IBR. We do have some time for questions. To kick off question and answer, our first question is, Adam, why do you choose Flosum over open source or free offerings? And how was that decision made?
Well, first and foremost, the accreditation boundary. The cybersecurity team is extremely particular about what they let into our org from App Exchange, or to even just touch our org with any kind of API call. And because Flosum is installed locally in our production org in GovCloud, we are able to use it without compromising any features or losing out on any feature sets. And then the repeatability and the allowing us to graft our developers from other jobs right into Salesforce without missing a step on anything other than how Salesforce works. They don't have to, learn a new religion or anything like that. They're able to just pick up and go, and Flosum essentially lets us act just like we're using Git on a command line.
All right, and my second question, by using a purpose-built tool for Salesforce, what productivity gains did you see?
Is that to me too?
Yes.
Okay. So I kind of touched on it in the slides a little bit. We saw a 1/3 increase in development time, or decrease, I should say, in development time, and we cut our release process in half. Being able to just point at an org and say, make this org look like another org, and not have to figure out how to apply change sets. And we can also look at it before we go in and realize if somebody's merge stomped someone else, saying things like, oh, look, the impact analysis shows that someone touched the contact object. That shouldn't be touched at all. And what did they do? Did they screw up or whatever? And that sort of thing.
Thanks. And my last question, John, during your demo, the look and feel was exactly like Salesforce. Did you ever leave the Salesforce environment?
Nope, everything is built 100% in Salesforce. We have our own repository in Salesforce. All your metadata stays within, Salesforce orgs. It goes back and forth. So there's nothing external needed. It's all very easy to use.
Thank you, Bill, Adam, and John, being with us today. I would also like to thank all of our participants who joined us today. We hope this webinar has been helpful for you and your organization. If you have any questions, our contact information is displayed on the screen. Please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.